The proximity alarm sounds at 4:12, and I am already awake. That is the thing about 14 years at outer corridor postings. You stop sleeping all the way through. Some part of you stays listening, cataloging the ambient sounds of wherever you are, marking the ones that belong and holding a quiet watch for the ones that don't. The plateau wind belongs. The secondary hull contraction at low temperature belongs. The outer intake bay doors weather seal belongs. A low intermittent percussion when the gusts come off the northern ridge. The proximity alarm does not belong at 4:12, because the next scheduled supply run is not for 11 days, and the corridor authority check-in is not until 900. I was out of the bunk and into my field jacket before the second pulse. The post is one room. That is not a complaint, it is a description. Kesaldivar Outer Medical Post 12 occupies a stone and prefab shelter on the plateau shoulder of the corridor Moon's primary ridgeline, 2 transit corridors from the nearest hub, positioned specifically because there is nothing else out here and something is always going wrong. 2 transit corridors from the nearest hub. 1 treatment table, 1 warming cabinet, 1 relay terminal, 1 field kit rack. 2 diagnostic sensor units, 1 primary and 1 backup, because the backup has saved me twice. 1 window that faces north and shows nothing but the plateau's gray granite surface running flat to the ridge, and then the sky, which at 4:12 in the first month of the cold season was the particular dark of a place that sees no artificial light for 40 kilometers in any direction. I pulled on my thermal oversuit at the door, checked the external temperature reading on the small display beside the coat hooks, -19 degrees, wind corrected -27, and stepped through into the outer intake bay. She was on the floor. Small. That was the first fact, and it registered before anything else. A small shape against the bay's east wall, not moving, wrapped in a secondary transit blanket of the kind issued at corridor way station departure points, when a passenger needs to move quickly through open air. Secondary blankets are a single thermal layer, rated for 20 minutes in ambient temperatures no lower than -8. They are intended for the walk between a vessel's docking collar and a receiving facility's heated interior. They are not intended for a plateau moon at -19, with a wind that has been running consistent for 6 days off the northern ridge. I crossed the bay in 4 steps and crouched. Velthorin. I placed the species in the first second, the ash-violet skin tone, pale as old slate, the specific undertone that distinguishes Velthorin from the 3 other species with similar surface coloring in this corridor. The ear structure confirmed it, the elongated pointed configuration that angles slightly rearward at the tip, a feature no other species in the corridor shares in exactly that form. Double iris eyes, closed. Silver-white hair, damp at the temples despite the cold, which means the body had been generating heat until recently and then stopped. She was small, the way children are small, with the proportions that mean young and not merely slight, the limb-to-torso ratio that no adult mimics, and she was not shivering. The absence of shivering is not a good sign. Shivering is the metabolic engine fighting. The absence means the engine has begun to consider whether fighting is still an option worth the energy expenditure. I got my hands under her, one at her shoulders, one under her knees, and carried her inside. The treatment table's warming surface takes 90 seconds to reach working temperature. I laid her down, pulled the transit blanket away, started the surface, and reached for the primary diagnostic sensor before I had finished clearing the blanket. The blanket fell to the floor and I let it stay there. The sensor pass across the outer extremities gave me skin temperature at the fingertips, 4 degrees below Velthorin baseline. The sternum pass gave me core, 6.2 degrees below baseline. Pulse on manual palpation at the wrist. Present, slow, the long deliberate rhythm that Velthorin physiology drops into under thermal stress. A metabolic conservation response that looks like cardiac compromise to anyone who hasn't read the species supplement, and is not quite, yet, provided the conservation mode doesn't continue much longer. I started the warming protocol. It was while I was adjusting the table's contact zones, calibrating the secondary thermal layer to the Velthorin species-specific warming sequence, that I noticed the paper. It had been folded inside the transit blanket, tucked at the upper margin where a person carrying the child would not have seen it, but a physician removing the blanket would. Folded twice, compact administrative format, printed on the heavier stock that corridor authority waypoints use for documentation that is meant to travel with a subject and be read at destination. The creasing pattern suggested it had been in the blanket since the blanket was issued, which meant someone had placed it there deliberately before the child was handed to whoever had brought her here. I smoothed it on the counter beside the relay terminal and read it once, beginning to end, without stopping. Then I set it down, went back to the patient, and continued the warming protocol. The document was a Velketh Secondary Holdings Administrative Hold Instrument, filed under Article 9, Subsection 4 of the Compact Bilateral Welfare Code, with a secondary determination appended from the Velketh Corridor Welfare Redistribution Division. Case reference VKR 29 THORAN S. The subject line used the child's compact intake designation rather than a name, which is what happens when the intake was processed by an administrative officer rather than a welfare officer. The determination paragraph read as follows, and I am reconstructing it from the copy I subsequently scanned into the case record. Subject classified as non-viable welfare recipient per Schedule B criteria, Compact Bilateral Welfare Code. Standard medical intervention threshold not met under Schedule B cost-benefit assessment. Administrative hold on medical resource allocation effective at time of issuance. Welfare resource redirection to secondary administrative review authorized. The authorization signature was a Velketh Holdings Secondary Administrative Officer, Grade 4. The date was 2 days prior to this morning. Non-viable welfare recipient is not a medical classification. I want to be precise about that, because the events of the following hours turned substantially on the question of what that phrase is and is not, and on whether a document containing it has any bearing on what a physician does at a treatment table. Non-viable is a clinical term with a specific definition in emergency medicine. It describes a patient whose injuries or physiological status have progressed to a point at which intervention cannot meaningfully alter the outcome. It has established criteria. There are checklists. I have used the word exactly twice in 22 years of medical practice, both times after extended resuscitation attempts on patients who had been without cardiac function for intervals beyond clinical recovery range. Both times with a second physician present and concurring, both times documented to a standard that would survive a medical board review. The word means something specific, and it means that specific thing because medicine requires precision in its language in the same way it requires precision in its instruments. What the Velketh Administrative Hold used the phrase to mean was, this child's welfare case does not meet the administrative cost threshold for continued resource allocation under a provision called Schedule B, and we have therefore authorized her removal from the active welfare registry. That is not a medical determination. It is a budget classification applied to a living patient. The distinction matters enormously. I know every relevant provision of the Compact Bilateral Medical Protocol, not because someone tested me on it, but because 14 years at outer corridor postings teaches you that the text is the only consultation available at 3 in the morning when the nearest colleague is 2 transit corridors away. I had read Article 14 of the Compact Bilateral Welfare Supplement before I read the whole document. I had read it in my first month at every posting I had ever held, because it is the provision that governs what I am permitted and required to do, and I have never been willing to discover its contents under operational pressure. Article 14, Subsection 3, Paragraph 1, which I can reproduce accurately because I have read it many times. Any registered compact medical officer who takes emergency intake of a patient presenting with life-threatening physiological status, has mandatory treatment obligation that supersedes all secondary administrative holds, welfare allocation instruments, and non-emergency classification decisions issued by non-medical authorities for the duration of the clinical emergency and until the patient is transferred to another registered medical officer. I am a registered compact medical officer. I had taken emergency intake of a patient presenting with life-threatening physiological status. The hold was a non-emergency classification decision issued by a non-medical authority. The hold's legal standing in this room, relative to my Article 14 obligation, was exactly 0, and had been 0 from the moment I initiated treatment. I did not throw the document away. I did not destroy it. A document that has been filed in a case record is part of that record whether it has legal standing or not, and the case record is the physician's responsibility. I left it on the counter and went back to the patient. The warming protocol for Velthorin physiology differs from the standard compact protocol in 3 specific ways that are not immediately obvious, and that a physician who had not read the species supplement, a document available in the Hub 7 Medical Library, and in the Corridor Authority Medical Network database, which costs nothing to access and takes 4 hours to read fully, would miss. First, the warming surface contact zones should be configured for proximal to central advancement rather than the standard distal to central sequence. In Velthorin patients in metabolic conservation mode, warming the extremities first triggers a peripheral vascular response that, counterintuitively, can cause a secondary drop in core temperature before the core begins to rise. The standard protocol produces this effect in Velthorin patients. The species supplement corrects it. Second, the core temperature target in the first 2 hours of treatment is not restoration to full baseline but stabilization at 2 degrees below baseline. Moving faster than that risks a Velthorin-specific complication called thermal normalization cascade, which presents as cardiac arrhythmia, and which is avoided entirely by the controlled advancement the supplement specifies. Third, fluid support should be held unless specific secondary indicators present, because the Velthorin vascular system under thermal conservation shifts fluid volume in a pattern that reads as dehydration on standard monitoring equipment, but is not, and supplementing what appears to be a deficit in a patient who does not actually have one creates secondary complications that are harder to manage than the hypothermia itself. I ran the proximal warming sequence. I set the core target at -2 from baseline. I held the fluid support and watched the secondary indicators for the specific presentation that would change that decision. None of them appeared. I did not supplement. At 5:47, I filed the Article 14 Emergency Medical override with the Compact Bilateral Welfare Panel at Hub 7. The override is a documented filing with mandatory fields: the patient's intake case reference, the filing physician's compact medical registration number, the presenting physiological status, the treatment in progress, and the supersession argument, the specific paragraph and clause of Article 14 being invoked, and the specific administrative instruments being superseded. I included the Velkith case reference. I included the whole document's case number. I summarized the patient's presentation in clinical terms and described the warming protocol in progress. I cited Article 14 subsection 3 paragraph 1, and I cited it fully, not in abbreviated form, because an incomplete citation has been successfully challenged on procedural grounds in at least 2 prior corridor authority cases that I was aware of, and I was not going to give anyone that opening. The panel acknowledged receipt at 6:02 and flagged the file for emergency welfare review. I noted the acknowledgement timestamp in the case record and continued the treatment. By 700, the core temperature had advanced from -6.2 to -4.8. The rate was appropriate, not too fast, not too slow, matching the species supplement's recommended curve within acceptable variance. The pulse had strengthened slightly, the long, deliberate conservation rhythm persisting, but with somewhat more volume behind it. The way an engine that has decided to keep running sounds different from one that is still making that decision. The second problem arrived at 7:31. I heard the crawler before I saw it. The specific engine signature of a medium-range all-terrain vehicle on the plateau access road. The pitch that indicates the heavier grade of Corridor Authority class vehicle, rather than the supply run or personal transit grades I was more accustomed to hearing on this road. The sound came in from the south, where the plateau road drops off the ridge shoulder and runs 14 kilometers to the secondary way station, where the Velketh Holdings Authority maintained a corridor administrative office. I had been expecting something from that direction since I filed the override at 5:47. I had not expected it at 7:31. They had driven in the dark, on a cold season plateau road, in a wind that had been running consistent for 6 days. Someone had wanted to arrive before the panel review had time to progress. I stepped to the relay terminal, sent a status update to Hub 7 noting the arrival and my expectation of an enforcement contact, and was back at the treatment table before the outer intake bay door opened. The Velketh Secondary Holdings Administrative Coordinator was a tall Velketh male, gray-green Secondary Authority transit coat with formal insignia at the collar, a document case in his right hand. He had a transit specialist with him, a smaller Velketh individual carrying a second document case. Both of them stopped at the inner bay threshold when they saw me standing at the treatment table with my hands on the patient and the warming surface running. The coordinator looked at the child on the table. He looked at me. He looked at the document on the counter beside the relay terminal. "You received the hold instrument," he said. "I read it," I said. "The patient is in the second hour of a warming protocol for Velthorin hypothermic metabolic cascade. I am not available for administrative proceedings at this time." He set his document case on the counter. He opened it and removed a second document, heavier paper than the hold, multi-page, the formal printing that Corridor Authority enforcement instruments use, with the secondary authority embossing at the top and the case reference in the standard position. "This is an Article 9 enforcement notice," he said. "Under the Velketh Secondary Holdings Administrative Authority, subsection 7, paragraph 3. It compels compliance with the outstanding administrative hold instrument and authorizes removal of the subject from this facility to a secondary administrative review location." "You can leave it on the counter," I said, "with the other one." He stopped. The transit specialist took half a step back. "I do not think it was deliberate. I think it was the body responding to a situation before the mind had decided how to respond." "Dr. Vale," I said. "Senna Vale, Compact Medical Officer Registration COMO 46 VAELLS, 22 years active practice, 14 at Outer Corridor postings, currently the sole registered physician within 2 transit corridors of this location." The warming surface readout was in my peripheral vision. Core temperature, -4.8, unchanged in the last 5 minutes, which was expected. There is a plateau in the warming curve for Velthorin patients at approximately this point, a brief thermal equilibration that lasts 20 to 40 minutes before the curve resumes. I kept one hand in contact with the patient's shoulder, which is not strictly required by the protocol, but which a physician who has been at this long enough knows is not nothing. Sustained physical contact from a stable, warm presence during metabolic recovery has documented positive effects in Velthorin patients, cited in the species supplement appendix. The Article 14 supersession I filed with Hub 7 at 5:47 covers this patient's treatment for the duration of the clinical emergency. A Grade 4 administrative hold from a non-medical secondary holdings authority does not override a registered physician's Article 14 emergency treatment obligation. An Article 9 enforcement notice from the same authority carries the same non-override status. for the same reason. The supersession was filed, acknowledged, and active before your vehicle left the way station. The welfare panel has not yet issued a ruling on the supersession filing, he said. The supersession is effective from the moment of filing and acknowledgement, I said. Subsection 3, paragraph 1. The ruling confirms and documents the supersession. It does not create it. I can show you the paragraph. There is a printed copy of the bilateral medical protocol in the red binder on the second shelf, if you would like to read it. He looked at the red binder. He did not move toward it. He looked at the warming surface, at the readout above the table, at the small hand visible at the edge of the thermal contact layer. Then he looked at me. The hold was issued under properly authorized secondary holdings protocols, he said. The subject was classified under Schedule B criteria as non-viable welfare recipient, I said. I read that. The phrase is not a medical classification. It does not appear in the Compact Clinical Standards. It does not appear in the Velthorin Medical Supplement, 2nd edition, which is the current reference for species-specific treatment in this corridor. It does not appear in the Bilateral Emergency Protocol or in any instrument issued by the Compact Medical Board. It appears, to the best of my reading, to be an administrative budget designation applied through a provision called Schedule B. Schedule B does not govern my clinical practice. My clinical practice is governed by the Compact Medical Standards, the Species Supplement, and the Bilateral Emergency Protocol. Under those instruments, the patient on this table presented with a life-threatening physiological status, and my treatment obligation was mandatory from the moment I initiated care. I paused. The plateau wind ran against the north wall. The patient's core temperature at intake was 6.2 degrees below Velthorin baseline. She was in the outer intake bay of an unheated structure on a plateau moon at -19 ambient temperature with a single-layer transit blanket, which is rated for 20-minute exposure above -8. The duration of her exposure before I found her is not known. The clinical presentation was unambiguous. A silence in the room that had the quality of something being reconsidered. If you proceed with treatment against the hold instrument, he said finally, the Secondary Holdings Authority will file a formal complaint with the Compact Medical Review Board regarding unauthorized treatment of an administratively classified welfare subject. They are welcome to, I said. The complaint address for the Compact Medical Review Board is listed on the Hub 7 main relay directory under Administrative Contacts. Would you like me to find it for you? I had moved slightly around the table to check the secondary indicator set, 3 monitoring points that I check manually every 20 minutes in the first 4 hours regardless of what the sensors show, because sensors read what they are calibrated to read, and a physician reads what is in front of them. The indicators were where I expected them. I will note in the case record that enforcement contact occurred at 7:31 and that the enforcement notice was declined on Article 14 grounds. I will note the complaint threat. Both will be part of the file the medical board receives if a complaint is filed. He was quiet for longer this time. The transit specialist had not moved from the half-step back position. Outside, the crawler engine ticked as it cooled in the -19 air. We will wait for the panel determination, he said. The waiting area is the outer bay, I said. There is a bench along the south wall. The bay is unheated, but I can provide a secondary transit blanket if the wait is long. I said this without particular inflection. I am not certain what tone I intended. I will relay the panel determination to you when it arrives. He picked up his enforcement notice from the counter. He left the original hold where it was. He and the transit specialist went back through the inner bay door. I heard the outer door seal, and then, a few minutes later, the crawler engine starting, but only idling, not leaving. They were staying on the road south of the post, waiting for the determination to come down. I went back to the patient and the protocol. The warming curve resumed its advance at approximately 8:40. I noted the resumption in the clinical log with the timestamp and the rate, which was appropriate, within the species supplement's specified parameters, neither too fast nor too slow. The patient had not regained consciousness, which at this stage of Velthorin hypothermic recovery is expected. The species supplement is specific on this point. Velthorin patients in metabolic conservation mode typically do not regain consciousness until the core temperature reaches within 1 degree of baseline. The unconscious period is not a clinical concern, provided the physiological parameters are tracking correctly. The parameters were tracking correctly. I made tea at 900 because 14 years of outer corridor practice has taught me that there is no situation so urgent that hydration becomes irrelevant, and I had been in the post for 4.5 hours without eating or drinking anything. I drank it standing at the counter beside the relay terminal, watching the warming surface readout, and I thought about the 2 documents on the counter beside me. One of them cited a provision called Schedule B. I had not heard of Schedule B before reading the whole document, because I do not read administrative cost assessment frameworks in my professional preparation. I read medical protocols. I read species supplements. I read bilateral welfare provisions that intersect with my clinical practice. I had not, before this morning, had cause to read the compact bilateral welfare code's administrative cost assessment framework, because administrative cost assessment is not medicine. I had, however, after reading the whole document, opened the welfare code on the relay terminal and searched for Schedule B. It had taken me 11 minutes to determine that Schedule B did not exist in the current code. It had been superseded 11 years ago. The revision notes, appended to every current copy of the code at section header E of the administrative appendix, noted the supersession and cited the replacement provision, which was structured entirely differently and did not include any mechanism for classifying a welfare subject as non-viable for resource allocation purposes. The comprehensive bilateral welfare supplement that replaced the old code had explicitly removed that classification framework on the grounds that it had been misused. I had noted this in the case record at 8:41, after the warming curve resumed. I had noted it under the heading Administrative Hold Instrument Assessment, and I had cited the revision notes and the appendix section. I had done this not because I needed it for the treatment decision. The treatment decision had been made at 4:12 on clinical grounds, but because the case record would go to the panel and then to the welfare board, and both of those bodies benefit from having the legal groundwork laid clearly in the record rather than having to discover it themselves. The panel determination arrived at 10:47. I was in the second phase of the protocol by then, the controlled advancement from -2 toward full baseline, which requires more active management than the initial stabilization. The thermal surface calibration changes at the transition between phases, and the rate of advancement must be held within a narrower band than in the first phase to avoid the arrhythmia cascade. I had the relay terminal on audio, only so I could hear incoming notifications without breaking the contact requirements. The panel determination was read into the audio channel by a welfare officer at Hub 7, whose name I did not know, and whose voice was the measured, inflection-free register of someone who reads official determinations daily. She read the case reference. She read the determination date and time. She read the grounds. The Administrative Hold Instrument Case Reference, VKR 29THORAN-S, was found void on 3 independent grounds. First, Schedule B, cited in the hold's classification of the subject as a non-viable welfare recipient, is not a provision of the current compact bilateral welfare code. Schedule B was superseded 11 years ago by the comprehensive bilateral welfare supplement. The supersession is documented in the revision notes appended to every current edition of the code. The Velkoth Holdings secondary administrative officer who issued the hold had cited a provision that had not been in force for 11 years. Second, Article 9, subsection 4 of the current code, cited as the hold's authority, pertains exclusively to administrative holds on material resource allocation in non-emergency welfare cases. Once an Article 14 emergency medical supersession has been filed and acknowledged for a patient, that patient's case is removed from the scope of Article 9, subsection 4 for the duration of the clinical emergency. The Article 14 supersession had been filed at 5:47 and acknowledged at 6:02. The enforcement notice filed by the coordinator at 7:31 was therefore without jurisdiction from the moment of its filing, and any compliance it purported to compel was legally inapplicable. Third, case reference VKR 29THORAN-S had not been registered with the Compact Bilateral Welfare Panel prior to the hold's issuance, as required by Article 7 of the Bilateral Welfare Supplement for any administrative hold affecting a primary welfare case. The hold had been issued without the mandatory pre-registration. It was procedurally invalid on its face under Article 7, independently of any other grounds. The panel voided the hold on all three grounds. It voided the enforcement notice on the Article 14 jurisdictional ground. It flagged case reference VKR 29THORAN-S for Welfare Board review, specifically the pattern of a Schedule B citation from a provision superseded 11 years ago, and assigned the case an emergency primary welfare pathway on the grounds that the subject was a minor with no registered custodian currently identified. I noted all of this in the clinical log. I relayed the determination to the coordinator in the outer bay as I had said I would. 5 minutes later, I heard the crawler engine change pitch from idle to transit and then diminish southward on the plateau road. I did not go to the window. The patient's eyes opened at 11:14. The core temperature had reached -1 from baseline at approximately 10:50, and the warming curve was continuing its appropriate advance. The consciousness onset was on schedule. I was at the table when her eyes opened, the double iris configuration, copper amber in the outer ring, a lighter near white at the inner iris, both rings clearly defined and reactive to the treatment room's lighting, which told me the visual system had recovered well from the conservation period. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the thermal surface under her hands. She looked at me. She said nothing. I did not attempt conversation. The standard practice with recovered hypothermic patients is to establish orientation gently and give the patient time to take inventory of their situation before expecting them to engage with it. "You are in a medical post," I said. "On the plateau North Ridge, it is warm here. You are safe." She looked at me for a sustained moment with the careful, systematic attention of someone running a diagnostic rather than someone who is frightened. Then she looked at the ceiling again, tracing the prefab panel joins with her gaze, and then the north window, and then the relay terminal, and then the red binder on the second shelf. Cataloging, noting what was where. At 1300, I made the evacuation decision. Core temperature was at baseline. Pulse was strong and regular, the conservation rhythm fully resolved into the normal waking pattern. The secondary indicators had all cleared. She was ambulance safe for a 2-hour plateau road transit in a properly equipped crawler with continuous monitoring. I prepared the crawler's medical configuration myself. Rear thermal compartment, supplementary warming blankets, the portable monitoring unit secured to the rear bulkhead, emergency supply kit loaded, relay terminal active and linked to Hub 7 so that the Hub's receiving team could see the monitoring feed throughout the transit. I filed the evacuation notification with Hub 7 and requested the Velthorin specialist to be available at the receiving bay. Then I carried sail from the treatment table to the crawler, which is not standard 2-person protocol, but which is the only available protocol when you are the only person at Outer Medical Post 12. She was lighter than she should have been. Not dramatically so, not in the range that registers on the diagnostic sensors as a clinical emergency in its own right, but in the specific way that a child who has not been eating properly for some weeks is lighter than the expected weight for her evident age and build. I noted it without comment, because she was awake and watching me carry her with the same systematic attention she had been applying to the treatment room, and the fact of her own weight was not something that needed me to announce it. I got her settled in the rear compartment, confirmed the monitoring connections, made sure the warming blankets were properly positioned and would not interfere with the monitoring contacts, and climbed into the driver's position. 2 hours, I said, to the monitoring console and to her. The road runs south along the ridge shoulder and then east across the plateau. It is cold outside, but you will not feel it in the rear compartment. The crawler's thermal systems maintain the back at standard interior temperature. The monitoring unit will alert me to any change in your readings. I will check directly every 30 minutes regardless. A pause from the rear compartment, the particular quality of a pause in which someone is considering whether to speak. "What is your name?" The voice was small and careful, precise in its compact standard pronunciation in the way that someone who has studied the language formally is precise. Each phoneme in its correct position, the natural flow of a native speaker not quite there, but the accuracy of a serious student fully present. "Senna," I said, "Dr. Senna Vale." Another pause. "Why did you not follow the document?" I started the crawler. The plateau road south was gray granite gravel packed hard by the cold. The surface that experienced correctly feels almost like pavement in the crawler's suspension system. The wind came off the ridge at an angle that pushed the vehicle left, requiring a consistent countercorrection, a physical habit after 3 years of this road. I drove for several seconds before answering. "Because the document was not a medical document," I said. "It was an administrative document issued by a non-medical authority. Administrative documents issued by non-medical authorities do not determine what I do at a treatment table. Medical protocols determine what I do at a treatment table. The medical protocol said to treat you. I treated you. The others followed it," she said. I drove another kilometer. The others? I had not asked, and I was not going to ask now, because she had been through whatever sequence of events had placed her in an unheated intake bay on a plateau moon in a single-layer transit blanket, and the recounting of that sequence was hers to offer on her own terms, on her own schedule, to the welfare officer, who would eventually ask the questions that needed to be asked in a format that could be used. The secondary transit blanket itself said something. You do not transport a Velthoran child in a secondary transit blanket on a plateau moon in the cold season, because a medical officer instructed you to. You do it because someone else instructed you not to provide better covering, and you found that instruction more authoritative than the evidence in front of you. The document was wrong, I said, medically and procedurally wrong, as the panel determination confirmed. The Schedule B provision it cited hasn't existed for 11 years. The Article 9 authority it claimed had been superseded by my Article 14 filing before the enforcement attempt was made. The pre-registration required by Article 7 was never completed. People who followed it were either told that it was correct, which it was not, or they understood that it was not correct and followed it anyway. I cannot tell you which from here. I checked the road ahead. Straight for the next 3 kilometers, the eastern arc visible in the middle distance where the plateau road begins its turn away from the ridge. What I can tell you is that the wrongness was discoverable by reading the document carefully and comparing it against the current code. I read it carefully. It took me 11 minutes to confirm that Schedule B no longer existed. 11 minutes is not a large investment against the stakes involved. From the rear compartment, a long, deliberate silence of the kind that is processing rather than empty. At the 30-minute mark, I checked the monitoring readout and confirmed the readings aloud so she could hear them. Core temperature, baseline plus 0.1, which is the mild hyperthermia that sometimes follows the warming protocol and is expected, not concerning. Pulse, strong and regular. Secondary indicators, all clear. "There is a stone in my bag," she said. I had not inventoried what she had arrived with. The cloth bag, a Velthorin child's carrying bag, worn at one shoulder seam, the kind of bag that gets repaired repeatedly because it is the bag that matters and not the condition of it, was in the rear compartment. "Yes," I said. "My mother gave it to me," she said. "Before she was taken to the review facility, she said to keep it." I kept driving. The eastern arc of the road came under the crawler's front wheels. "It has a white line through it," she said. "All the way from one side to the other." She said the line means that whatever is in the stone did not stop. It kept going until it came out the other side. I thought about this for the next 2 kilometers. The plateau road on its eastern track was less exposed to the ridge wind, and the driving steadied. Outside the crawler windows, the gray granite flat ran away south to the horizon, the way station visible eventually as a small cluster of prefab structures. And beyond that the hub, another 60 kilometers in the amber haze of the corridor, moon's late morning light. "That is a good stone," I said. "Yes," she said. A pause, then, "The document, the one on the counter, is it gone?" "The panel determination voided it," I said. "It has no legal standing." "But the paper is still there," she said, "on the counter." "Yes," I said, "the paper is still there." "What will you do with it?" I did not answer immediately, because I had not yet decided, and I did not want to tell her something I had not decided. I thought about it for the rest of the drive. The hub's receiving bay was staffed and ready when I pulled in. The relay feed had given them the clinical picture throughout the transit, and the Velthorin specialist, Dr. Oreth Vel, whose name I had heard referenced twice in my correspondence with Hub 7 over the past 3 years, but whom I had not met me at the bay door with a small team. She was a compact Velthorin woman with the copper and white coloring of the northwestern corridor populations, and she moved with the unhurried efficiency of a specialist who has been doing this long enough to know that unhurried is faster than rushed. I gave the clinical handover directly while the team transferred sail to the facility's internal warming system, which was more capable than the crawler's rear compartment and would complete the recovery process more effectively. I described the warming protocol applied, the timeline, the core temperature curve, the fluid hold, the reasoning for each deviation from the standard protocol, and my assessment of the secondary nutritional deficit. The weight, the estimated duration of the deficit based on what the monitoring data suggested about her baseline metabolic state, and the recommendation that it be addressed systematically rather than urgently. Oreth listened without interruption. At the end she said, "The species-specific protocol, the proximal sequence and the conservative advancement rate." "And the fluid hold," I said. "The supplement's Appendix C, Table 2. She nodded, a single professional acknowledgement. "The welfare case reference." "VKR 29THORINS, I said. "Voided at 10:47 by panel determination on 3 grounds. The panel flagged it for welfare board review and assigned the case an emergency primary welfare pathway. The full clinical record, including the Article 14 filing and the administrative hold instrument, is in the transfer packet." I paused. "She has a stone in her bag, gray, with a white quartz vein running through it. Please make sure it stays with her." Oreth looked at me for a moment with the brief evaluating look of a colleague noting something unexpected. "It will," she said. I signed the transfer documentation, confirmed the relay channel for case updates, and drove back on the plateau road to Outer Medical Post 12. The drive back takes the same road in reverse at the same speed, but it does not feel the same. Going out with a patient, every kilometer matters in a way that registers physically. Coming back alone, it is just a road. The gray granite flat ran north and then west as I made the arc back onto the ridge shoulder, and the primary star was continuing its arc across the sky, and the wind was still off the northern ridge at the same consistent speed it had been at all week. I got back at 1819. The post was exactly as I had left it, the warming surface still active on the treatment table, the secondary transit blanket on the floor where I had dropped it at 4:12, the diagnostic sensors in their brackets, the relay terminal with its queued messages, 3 of them, which I read in order, the panel's full written determination, a welfare board intake confirmation with the emergency primary pathway designation, and a message from the Compact Corridor Authority Medical Division, noting that the Article 14 filing had been received and recorded, and that, as of 1600, the Secondary Holdings Authority had not filed a formal medical board complaint. I filed all 3 in the case record. I picked up the transit blanket from the floor, assessed it, determined it was structurally intact, and returned it to the supply cabinet where the waystation replacement blankets were stored. Someone would find it useful. Then I stood at the counter and looked at the 2 documents. The hold. Case reference VKR 29 THORANS Schedule B, 11 years superseded. Non-viable welfare recipient. Grade 4 authorization. 2 days ago. The enforcement notice on top of it. Filed at 7:31 by a coordinator who had driven in the dark on a cold season plateau road because someone had wanted him to arrive before the panel had time to rule. Void from the moment of filing. Sale had asked from the back of the crawler, "What will you do with it?" I opened the relay terminal. I found the scanner function. I scanned both documents into the digital case record, with timestamps and notations indicating their status voided instruments, included in the case record for completeness and for the Welfare Board review. Then I filed the original paper copies in the physical archive cabinet, in the year-to-date case folder, where they would be available if the Welfare Board requested them. A voided document is not nothing. It is part of the history of a case, and the history of a case is the physician's obligation to maintain completely, not selectively. The whole document and the enforcement notice belonged in the record. They went into the record. I made a proper meal and ate it at the counter, because I had consumed nothing since the tea at 900, and the body does not negotiate on this point indefinitely. I sent a follow-up welfare message to Dr. Oreth Vell at Hub 7, requesting a case update when one was available, and noting the specific nutritional deficit parameters I had estimated for her team's reference. Her reply came at 21:03, patient stable and alert, eating adequately under nursing supervision, cooperative with the Velthorin specialist team, Welfare Board intake proceeding on the emergency primary pathway with expected timeline of 14 to 21 days for next of kin registry identification. The stone was with the patient. Oreth had confirmed the species-specific warming protocol application as correct procedure, and noted that any deviation would likely have resulted in the arrhythmia cascade in the second phase. I read this message twice. I filed it in the case record with a notation: transfer outcome, stable, primary welfare pathway active, specialist care ongoing. Then I added, in the comments field, which is optional and which I use when there is something the standard fields do not adequately record, patient asked the right questions throughout, demonstrated accurate situational comprehension and systematic independent assessment. Stone documented. The Welfare Board update arrived 17 days later. The primary pathway had identified Sale's mother through the Velthorin Secondary House Registry, a compact registered welfare advocate, active filing record going back 9 years, currently located at a resettlement processing hub 2 corridors south, where she had been held pending an administrative review of her own case. The Welfare Board had facilitated contact. Reunification proceedings were underway. The Welfare Board's preliminary finding regarding the VKR29THORAN-S instrument noted the Schedule B citation pattern, cross-referenced it against 3 other instruments filed by the same Grade 4 administrative officer in the preceding 18 months, and referred the matter to the Secondary Holdings Authority Oversight Board for a formal investigation. I read the update carefully. I filed it. I noted in the case record, mother located, case proceeding, pattern referral made. 2 weeks after that, a message came through the relay terminal at 8:41 on a Tuesday morning. Personal relay, standard format, sender listed as Velcorath Ale, a Velthorin name in the maternal line format of Old Velthorin naming convention, the mother's name as the address's first element. Hub 7 relay address, which meant she was still at the processing Hub 2 corridors south and sending through the Hub's public relay network. The message was 6 lines. It thanked me for the species-specific warming protocol and noted that the Velthorin specialist at Hub 7 had confirmed that the proximal sequence, the controlled advancement rate, and the fluid hold had been the correct treatment, and that departures from any of those 3 decisions would likely have produced secondary complications in the second phase. It said that Sale was well. It said that Sale had asked her to write. It said that Sale wanted me to know that she had the stone, and that it was on the shelf above her bed at the Hub welfare residence, where she was staying while the reunification proceedings completed. The last line said, "She asked me to tell you that it goes all the way through." I sat at the relay terminal in the morning light coming in the north window off the plateau and read this message twice, and then a third time, and then I sat for a while without reading anything. Then I typed a reply. I said I was glad the protocol had held. I said I was glad she had the stone. I said the panel determination and the Welfare Board referral were in the case file, and that the pattern referral regarding the Grade 4 administrative officer meant that the Oversight Board would be examining the instrument framework that had produced the VKR29THORAN-S hold, and that while I could not predict the outcome of that investigation, the instruments filed under the Schedule B citation had been formally flagged and were no longer operating unexamined. I said that if any new instruments appeared in relation to Sale or to her mother's case, the supersession precedent was now documented in the Compact Corridor Authority record and could be cited in any subsequent proceeding by any registered medical officer or welfare advocate. Then I added one more sentence, because it was true, and because it belonged in the record even if the record in this case was a personal relay message rather than a clinical file. I said, the document is in the archive. That is where documents belong. The case is still open on my end, which is how I run a welfare follow-up until the case is fully and formally resolved. When it closes, I will close it. Until then, I will keep reading the provisions. I sent the message. I turned off the relay terminal and walked to the north window. The plateau ran flat to the ridge. The primary star was up, the cold season light without warmth but with clarity, the 40-kilometer reach of gray granite doing what it always does, which is be exactly what it is. The wind was still off the northern ridge. It had been running for 23 days now. It would stop when it stopped, and the cold would ease when it eased, and the supply run would arrive in 4 more days, and the Corridor Authority check-in would happen at 900 tomorrow, and the next emergency would not announce itself. I have been the sole physician at Outer Medical Post 12 for 3 years. Before that, a mountain canyon facility for 5 years, and before that a plateau posting for 4, and before that a desert frontier hub for 2 years at the beginning when I was learning what it meant to be the only doctor in a place that needed one. 22 years of being the one who was there. The work does not change in its essentials across the postings. Someone is in front of you. They need what you can give. The question is whether you will give it. The provisions govern the conditions. The protocols govern the method. The species supplement governs the specific application. All of this is discoverable by reading, and I have read it. Not because someone tested me on it, but because a physician who has not read the applicable provisions is a physician who will, at the critical moment, be making decisions on the basis of what they assume rather than what they know. And in my experience, there is no outcome that improves by substituting assumption for knowledge. The document on the counter had asked me to be a different kind of physician. Not in those words. In its administrative language, its Grade 4 authorization, its 11-year superseded Schedule B citation, it had asked me to look at a small Velthoran child in a secondary transit blanket on a plateau moon at -19, and to allow an administrative budget classification to determine what I did at a treatment table. I had made a medical decision instead. I would make the same one again, and I would make it faster the next time, because the next time I will not need 11 minutes to confirm that Schedule B no longer exists. Somewhere 2 transit corridors south, on a shelf above a bed in a hub welfare residence, a gray stone sat with a white quartz vein running through it from one side to the other. The vein had been in the stone for longer than the corridor had existed, longer than the transit routes, longer than the administrative frameworks and the welfare codes and the bilateral supplements and the Grade 4 signatures. It had been there because at some point, under sufficient pressure and over sufficient time, a mineral decides on a direction and takes it, and does not stop until it comes out the other side. The provisions were in the red binder on the second shelf. The case record was in the terminal. The archive was in the cabinet. I went back to work.